Good morning, Dan and Amy. Well, Afghan President Ashraf Ghani is hailing President Trump's decision to escalate U.S. presence in Afghanistan, not committing to specific troop levels, but the indication is that we're talking about 4,000 more U.S. troops in addition to the 8,400 already deployed in Afghanistan. President Trump, though, being specific as to the parameters of his support for escalation.
Our commitment is not unlimited, and our support is not a blank check.
Saying that ultimately this is up to the Afghanis.
The young men and women we send to fight our wars abroad deserve to return to a country that is not at war with itself at home. We cannot remain a force for peace in the world if we are not at peace with each other.
Well, that was in part a statement about troops coming home to a unified country, unified in support for them, as well as unified along racial lines, a clear reference to Charlottesville, but also just in terms of Afghans ultimately being the deciding factor on what kind of country they're going to have.
Ultimately, it is up to the people of Afghanistan to take ownership of their future, to govern their society, and to achieve an everlasting peace.
So for more on this and whether this was a judicious decision, we're pleased to be joined by our friend Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. He, the president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, as well as a former U.S. Navy lieutenant and the author of the book, A Battle for the Soul of Islam. Dr. Jasser, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Oh, it's great to be with you. Thanks for having me back.
So one of the arguments is that by changing the protocols, by shaming the Pakistanis to be more helpful, that we're going to fight a different war in Afghanistan than we've been fighting with these additional troops. And that will be decisive in killing the terrorists and establishing a stable Afghanistan. Do you support that view?
I do. Yeah, I think, there was only room for improvement compared to the war we've been fighting in the last 8 years with the Obama administration with both hands tied behind our backs and really holding back the Department of Defense from doing what they felt necessary. And it really doesn't need that many troops. I mean, the bottom line is American interests have been served after many conflicts by leaving some type of troop presence, be it in Korea, Germany, Japan, wherever. And at the end of the day, I think that obviously not only was 9/11 planned from Afghanistan, but the Taliban has become a significant haven for the interest of ISIS and radicals that want to attack us. And where America is absent, that void gets filled. I mean, the Taliban has been fueled and armed by Russia. It is doing operations and connections with many of our enemies. So we have to, anywhere we leave, it's easy to say, well, we're never going to nation build and that's not going to work. However, our absence ends up getting filled by our greatest enemy, who will ultimately help usher in threats to our homeland and to the West. So we can't live in a world where we know we need a CIA, we know we need intelligence and other things abroad, and then say, well, we can't send any troops at all. I agree with minimizing the troop deployment. I wish I had heard more yesterday from President Trump about how this is the tip of the iceberg. We need a more global strategy against political Islamist movements. The Taliban is just one of them. But I think as far as Afghanistan strategy goes, it was a welcome reassurance.
But do the local Afghanis, the people that aren't involved in terrorist groups, do they want us there?
Oh, absolutely. Every soldier I've talked to and military strategist tells me that they were very horrified to see us leaving because it becomes a battle between warlords and Islamists, and the Islamists are getting fueled by Russia, Iran, Qatar, and others. So the only options they have for that third pathway of a more stable Afghanistan is with Western support.
Well, just going back to the comparison to having troops left behind in Japan or Germany, Korea, but they're not being killed in real time as troops deployed in Afghanistan are, some even this month, 16 years in. And I guess the question is, going back to this, what does victory look like? Victory looks like a stable Afghanistan that's not a haven for terrorism. So if it requires this kind of troop presence, and we don't want this to be a safe haven for terrorism, then don't we necessarily, by that standard, have to escalate our troop presences all throughout North Africa, into the Middle East, into Central Asia? Because this is hardly the only potential incubator.
Well, I don't think it's a binary equation. I think you have to educate the American public, as I think he began to do, but I'm not sure he and I are on the same page on this. But I think that ultimately there is what is the setting of expectations? In the Cold War against the Soviets, I don't believe in the 60s and 70s people were saying, well, why isn't this over tomorrow? Everyone agreed there was a threat from the Soviet Union, and they had imperial threats. And I think the American public needs to realize that the Afghani conflict is but one battlefront in the global war that political Islam, Islamic republics, be it Iranian Republic, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, Syria's both sides of the equation in Syria, the Saudi Wahhabis that are supposedly our allies, and the fuel of radical Islam that they fuel. So this is a global conflict that isn't going to go away in this generation. And ultimately, there is no military solution. But the military part of it is one battlefront where we need to continue the whack-a-mole process. Otherwise, that whack-a-mole will come back to threaten us. But there is definitely a much larger non-military component that is the only solution, which is an ideological component that includes, like in the Cold War, we had the U.S. Information Agency, and now we're not battling that war of ideas. And I was saddened not to hear President Trump talk about Islamist threats, et cetera. The only thing he came close to doing was when he mentioned Pakistan's influence. But I think we need to start rolling up our sleeves and getting into the ideological part of this global battle.
Well, since you mentioned the Soviet Union, what we did is arm the Mujahideen. And so why couldn't we arm those trained security forces that are loyal to Ghani and opposed to the Taliban while we pursue the ideological war, which, as you say, is more mission critical, without deploying more troops or keeping 12,000 American troops deployed in Kabul and Afghanistan?
Well, I think some of that is exactly what the military wants to do, and I think that's why you only need 4,000 troops. 4,000 troops aren't going to do much in Afghanistan other than train other actors in order to preserve some stability. But having said that, this is a whole new world since the Arab awakening in 2011. Your calculus there is a 20th century calculus where we try to maintain stability and fix the lesser of evils. I think the Arab awakening, as we saw in Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, and elsewhere, yes, those places have become vacuumed and chaotic, but the only way for 21st century stability globally is for the defeat of both radical Islamic groups like Taliban and Brotherhood and others, and these dictators who are cauldrons for our enemies. They will never produce societies. And as the president mentioned, nation building is a doomed process. However, there can be a third pathway in these countries for civil society, for secular groups that share our values. And that is a long-term process that I think the American public needs to start understanding is the only avenue for a quarter of the world's population. Afghanistan is one Islamic country of 56 countries that are going through what I believe is the beginning of a reformation against theocracy. Either we can sit it out and let those vacuums get filled by the Russias and Chinas and Irans of the world, or we begin to be involved much more so non-militarily, not with our lives and treasure, but at least with a strategy that has a doctrine that advances a third pathway of liberty and not just picking the lesser of two evils.
All right, so what is your definition then of victory in Afghanistan?
In the short term, it is shoring up a containment of the Taliban, stopping the Russian funding of the Taliban, the Pakistani influence, and maintaining some stability to allow the Afghani governmental institutions to begin to establish. In the long term, it's looking at a global picture where Afghanistan is part of the puzzle that includes Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and others, in which we begin to work with nascent secular movements like the Green Revolution in Iran, a third pathway in Syria, the anti-Wahhabis of Saudi Arabia and others, and the anti-Taliban in Afghanistan to help build civil society groups that share our values truly and aren't just simply geopolitically sharing our strategic stability in the region.
And what percentage? I mean, there's been a lot of public opinion polling that's used as a political weapon against this president or that president. But the standing of America in the minds of many of these Islamist countries is not particularly high. So, I mean, when we talk about it's a very small percentage of people, of Muslims who are radicalized and terrorist threats. That's true. Isn't it also a very small percentage of Muslims in places like Afghanistan that support anything resembling the peaceful pluralism of America?
Well, that's a great question. And I would tell you that as in any campaign process, the opinion processes and numbers are a byproduct of the amount of money and investment that we've put in spreading our ideas. So the image of America has been shaped by the Taliban, by the warlords, and those who control most of the media. We have not had radio-free Afghanistan, radio-free Islam that I think should be part of our public diplomacy program, which the Obama administration basically dismantled, and the Bush administration did very half-heartedly. And I think ultimately this is why we've had such poor polling. And having said that, there's still tens of thousands waiting to want to come to the West. They still view us and our values as something they aspire to. They just have a very demonized view of our government and our policies because that's what, I mean, on the one hand, the Afghani people want us there. On the other hand, the government tells the same government we're protecting in Afghanistan tells its folks that we are there to imperialize and uses the same propaganda against us. Because that's what sells from a populist standpoint among the Afghani people. We need to start having a radio-free Afghanistan and opening up and pushing an ideological battle that we've been completely missing in action, and that would change the opinions on the streets there.
All right. He is Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, co-founder of the Muslim Reform Movement, former U.S. Navy lieutenant, and if that isn't enough, he's also a medical doctor, and if that is enough, he's also the author of the book, A Battle for the Soul of Islam. Dr. Jasser, thanks as always for joining us. Appreciate it.
Anytime. Thank you for